This is a collection of excerpts from the novel The First Heretic, written by Aaron Dembski-Bowden, narrated by Sixpars Kayaken. I remember the day of judgment. Can you imagine looking up and seeing the stars fall from the sky? Can you imagine the heavens themselves raining fire upon the world below? You say you can picture it. I don't believe you. I'm not speaking of war. I'm not speaking of Prometheum's stinging oil scent, or the burning chemical reek of flames born of missile fire. Forget battle's crude pains and the sensory assault of orbital bombardment. I'm not speaking of mundane savagery, the incendiary ills men inflict upon other men. I speak of judgment. Divine judgment. The wrath of a God who looks upon the works of an entire world, and what he sees turns his heart sour. In his disgust, he sends flights of angels to deliver damnation. In his rage, he seeds the skies with fire and rains destruction upon the upturned faces of 6 billion worshippers. Now tell me again that you can imagine seeing the stars fall from the sky. Tell me you can imagine heaven weeping fire upon the land below, and a city burning so bright that all sight is scorched from your eyes as you watch it die. The day of judgment stole my eyes, but I can still illuminate you. I remember it all. And why wouldn't I? It was the last thing I ever saw. They came to us in skyborne vultures of blue iron and white fire, and they called themselves the 13th Legion, the warrior kings of Ultramar. We did not use those names, as they marched us from our homes, as they butchered those who dared to fight back, and as they poured divine annihilation upon everything we had built. We called them false angels. You came to me asking how my faith survived the day of judgment. I'll tell you a secret. When the stars fell, when the seas boiled and the earth burned, my faith didn't die. That is when I began to believe. God was real, and he hated us. The displacement of air resulted in a bang not far from a sonic boom. But that wasn't what sent Argel Tal reeling. He'd seen teleportation technology used before, had travelled via such rare means himself. But the noise was filtered to tolerable levels by his helm's perceptive systems. And it wasn't the light of a teleport flare that forced him to avert his eyes. This too would have been compensated for by his armor's internal sensors, dimming his eye lenses immediately. But he was blind. Blinded by gold, burning like molten metal. The Vox shrieked with thousands of his brothers voicing the same malady. But the reports from his brethren were dull, half lost in an assault of noise that shouldn't exist. It was a fault with the Vox. It was in his head. A crashing of waves loud enough to throw off his balance. Blind and almost deafened, Argel Tal felt his bolter slip from his grip. It took all his strength to remain standing. Lorgar Aurelian saw none of this. No blinding golden light. No deafening psychic roar. He saw 6 figures standing in unity, 5 of whom he did not recognize, and 1 he did. Behind him, the Ultramarines, not afflicted as his warriors were on their knees in an orderly display. Only Guilliman and the Sigillite remained standing. Lorgar looked back to the 6. The 5 ringed the familiar figure, and though the Primarch did not know them by name, he knew their creed. Achingly elaborate armor of rich gold, cloaks of royal scarlet draped from their shoulders, long halberds topped by weighty silver blades, gripped in hands that would never tremble. Custodians, the Emperor's guardians. Lorgar looked to the 6th figure, who was just a man. Despite the vigor of youth, age lines showed time's cracks across features that were both stern and gentle, all at once. The man's appearance depended entirely on which facet of his face one focused upon. He was a tired, aging man, and a heroic statue immortalized in life's prime. He was a young, grimacing warlord with cold eyes, and a confused elder on the edge of weeping. Lorgar focused on those eyes now, seeing the warmth of love within the benevolence of trust. The man blinked slowly, and as his eyes opened again, they were cold with the frigid touch of disappointment blending into the ice of disgust. Lorgar. His voice was quiet but strong, lost in the indecipherable vista between hatred and kindness. Father, Lorgar said to the Emperor of mankind. Sight returned, banishing the grotesque feeling of helplessness. Such emotion was anathema, prickling at Argyltal's skin with 1,000 insect legs. He managed to look through his dimmed visor, seeing a towering figure deep in a corona of agonizing white light. Around the figure, cloaked in gold-armored warriors hefted unique spears with practiced ease. Each one was the size of an Astartes, and no Astartes could fail to recognize them. Custodes. He managed to speak through teeth gritted at the light's intensity. It's... Zafin stammered. It's the... Custodes. I know who it is. Argyltal exhaled the words through clenched teeth, and that's when the voice hit him. Hit them all, in a wave of invisible force. Kneel. It whispered with the power of a hammer to the forehead. There was no resisting. Muscles acted instantly, no matter that many hearts fought not to obey. Argyltal was one of them. This was not fealty, nor worship, or service. This was slavery, and his instincts rebelled at the enforced devotion even as he obeyed it. 100,000 word-bearers kneeled in the dust of the perfect city, rendered prone by imperial decree. A legion was on its knees. Lorgar looked over his shoulder, taking in the seascape of his kneeling warriors. Fire flickered in his eyes when he returned his gaze to the Emperor. Father, Lorgar began, but the man shook his head. Kneel, he said. His timeless face was framed by dark hair, the same color as Lorgar's facial stubble. Like father, like son. What? The Primarch asked. He looked past the Emperor to Guilliman, straight-backed and proud. When he returned his gaze to his father, he wiped his eyes with his soft fingertips, as if to clear some lingering phantasm. Father. Kneel, Lorgar. Argyltal watched with clenched teeth as Lorgar lowered himself to one knee. His first instincts were fading now, replaced by reason and the comfort of faith. It was only right to kneel before the God Emperor. He willed his heart to slow. Despite the implied insult of his deity impelling him to abase himself, the rebellious anger resurfaced in a stinging adrenal flood only a moment later, as he watched the Ultramarines rise to their feet at Guilliman's command. He could see them watching, feel their eyes boring into him as he knelt before them. One legion's warriors stood in the Emperor's presence with a Primarch's blessing, while another was on its knees in the bones of a dead city. It was a moment that cast a dozen reflections, for the word-bearers had mirrored this action many times before, under alien skies. Legions laying claim to less discipline or grace might beat their chest and howl at the moon upon achieving compliance. But among the sons of Lorgar, victory was to be cherished in reverence and dignity. The triumphant warriors would kneel in the heart of the fallen city and heed the words of their chaplains. The rite of remembrance. A time to recall the sacrifices of lost brothers and reflect upon one's place in the world. Argyle Tal felt sweat painting cold trails down his temples and cheeks. Trembling threatened to take hold as his traitorous muscles bunched, locking in painful cramps. The joints of his armor thrummed with unreleased strength, forcing him to endure this perversion of the Legion's most sacred ritual. The voice returned. This time it gave the answers that the 17th Legion so craved. Lorgar looked into his father's unknowable face as the Emperor spoke. You are a general, my son, not a high priest. You were created for war, for conquest, to reunite the human race under the aegis of truth. No. The Emperor closed his eyes, and an image of Monarchia as it had been, bright and glorious, filled Lorgar's mind. This is worship, the Emperor had said. This is a poison to truth. You speak of me as a god, and forge worlds that suffer under the one lie that has brought humanity to the edge of extinction, time and time again. The people are joyous. The people are deceived. The people will burn when their faith is proven false. My words are loyal. Lorgar was no longer kneeling. He rose to his feet, his voice rising with him. My legion shapes the most fiercely loyal worlds in your Imperium. It is not my Imperium. The words thudded into Argyle Tal's mind like a stream of bolter shells. For a brief, hateful moment, he glanced at his retinal display to check his life signs. He was certain he was dying, and had he not already been on his knees, he would have fallen to them now. It is the Imperium of man, the empire of humanity, enlightened and saved by the truth. He heard Lorgar's reply this time. I speak no lies. You are a god, Lorgar. I will not be silenced because you do not like the melody of one single word. In your grip, 1,000 worlds turn. By your will, 1,000,000 vessels sail the void. You are immortal, undying, seeing all, knowing all that transpires across creation. Father, you are a god in all but name. All that remains is to confess to it. Lorgar. The voice came with a wall of pressure now. Dense and all too tactile. It pounded into Argyle Tal like a miasma of engine wash, heating his armor and throwing him to the ground. Around him, he could see his brothers sent sprawling, their armor skidding across the dust. Defiant in the cyclone of unseen energy, scrolls of scripture ripping from his armor. Lorgar raised his hand to point at his father. "You are a god! Say the words and end the lie!" The Emperor shook his head, not in defeat, but in calm defiance. "You are blind, my son. You cling to ancient perceptions and endanger us all with them. Let this end, Lorgar. Let this end with you heeding my words." The psychic wind died with a peal of thunder. Lorgar stood where he was, trembling for reasons his warriors couldn't discern. Blood ran from one ear, running in a slow trail down his tattooed neck. "I am listening, father," he said. The 7th captain hauled himself back to his feet, stumbling once and righting himself before his armor's stabilizers needed to compensate. He was one of the first word-bearers to rise. The others still struggled, shivering on hands and knees, or were locked in muscle spasms, their twitching limbs disturbing the dust. Argel Tal helped Zafen up, receiving a grunt of thanks. "Word-bearers, hear me well. You, among all my legions, are guilty of failure. You number more warriors than any other, excepting the 13th. Yet your conquests are the slowest, and your victories ring hollow." It hurt too much to look directly at the figure of white gold light, haloed by coruscating psychic fire, telling them with words of thunder that all their lives had been wasted. "You linger on compliant worlds for years after final victory, driving the populace into the worship of false faith, seeding cults of the naive and the deceived, erecting monuments to lies. All you have done in the Great Crusade is for naught. While all others succeeded and bring prosperity to the Imperium, you alone failed me." Lorgar stepped back from the figure, only now raising his arms to ward off its radiance. "Wage war as you were created to do. Serve the Imperium as you were born to do. Take with you the lesson learned here this day. You kneel in the ruination found at the end of a false path. Let this be your legion's rebirth." The Primarch managed a weak "Father." But it was spoken to emptiness. Another sonic boom of displacing air heralded the Emperor's return to orbit. The Ultramarines remained, watching the kneeling, trembling word-bearers in absolute silence. The Custodians stood alongside Guilliman, while the Primarch conferred with their apparent leader, whose helm bore a red crest to match his cloak. Argel Tal saw Cor Ferron rising with painful slowness, despite his Terminator armor making the task easier, with dense joints of snarling servos. Neither Argel Tal nor Zafen offered to help. Both of them made for the Primarch. While the word-bearers struggled to their feet, Lorgar crashed to his knees at last. The Emperor's golden sun stared at the surrounding city as if he recognized none of it, with no idea how he had reached this place. Dead eyes, too cold to cry, looked out upon his shamed legion and the rubble of the lesson they needed to learn. Argel Tal reached him first, Instinct compelled him to remove his own helm, and he disengaged the seals in his armoured collar, standing unmasked before his Primarch. "Aurelian," he'd said. For the first time, Argyle breathed the scorched air of Monarchia, unaltered by merciful filters. It reeked of the oil burned in 1,000 years of industry. Zaphen's earlier comment was haunting in its truth. It smelled like they'd lost a war. He didn't dare touch Lorgar. With his hand outstretched, just short of resting on his Primarch's shoulder, he whispered his father's name. Lorgar turned to regard him, his eyes lacking even a shadow of recognition. "Aurelian," Argyle said once again. He glanced at the staring figures of Guilliman and the Custodes. "My Primarch, come. We must return to our ships." For the first time, his hand rested on Lorgar's armoured shoulder, where a scroll of scripture at once hung. Ignoring his touch, Lorgar threw his head back and roared. The captain gripped the Primarch's golden pauldron, doing all he could to keep the demigod steady. Lorgar screamed, deep and low and long, at the uncaring sky. It lasted longer than mortal lungs would allow. When the anguished cry finally faltered, he ran his bare fingers along the broken ground. With a shaking hand, the Primarch smeared black ash across his face, tarnishing his features with the powdered bones of the perfect city. Zaphen's voice was low and urgent. "The Ultramarines are bearing witness to this. We must get him to safety." Lorgar's mask of ashes was already streaked with tears that cut trails in the dust. The two warriors renewed their grips, trying to bring the golden giant to his feet. For a wonder, instead of the expected slackness in his limbs, Lorgar spat onto the ground and rose with their aid. Both of them felt the trembling in Lorgar's limbs. Neither of them spoke of it. "Guilliman." The Primarch spoke his brother's name with an envenomed tongue. A shrug of his shoulders pushed Argyle and Zaphen aside. Immediately forgotten. Emotion flooded back into Lorgar's eyes. His gaze was locked on Guilliman, who returned it, passionless where Lorgar was inflamed. "Does it please you?" The word-bearer lord sneered. "To witness my shame?" Guilliman didn't answer, but Lorgar wouldn't back down. "Does it please you?" he pressed. "Do you enjoy seeing my efforts reduced to ashes while the father favours you?" Guilliman breathed slowly, utterly unfazed. He spoke as if no question had been asked. "Our father entrusted me to inform you of one last matter." "Then speak it and be gone." Lorgar reached for his Crozius on the ground and dragged it up from the ash. Dust rained from its spiked head. "These 5 warriors of the Legionis Custodes." The Ultramarines' Primarch inclined his head to them. "They are not alone. 15 more remain on my flagship. Our father has ordered them to accompany you, brother." Argyle closed his eyes at this final indignity. After kneeling in the ashes of failure, after being told by the Emperor that all their achievements were worthless. Now this. Lorgar laughed, the sound ripe with derision. His face was still smeared with dust. "I refuse. They cannot need it." "Our father believes otherwise," Guilliman had said. These warriors are to be his eyes as your legion rejoins the Great Crusade. And does our fathers set hounds to watch over you? Do they reside in your precious empire of Ultramar, whispering of your every move? I see the shadow of a smile on your lips. These others do not know you as I do, brother. Our sons may not see the amusement in your eyes, but I am not blind to such nuance. You have always possessed an active imagination. Today has proven that. Today has proven that. My devotion is my strength. Lorgar clenched his perfect teeth. You have no heart, and no soul. A snort blackened his angelic features with a disgusted twist. I pray that one day you feel as I feel. You smile if one of Ultramar's worlds died in fire. Tarentus, Espander, Calv. You should return to your fleet, brother. Guilliman uncrossed his arms, revealing the golden aquila emblazoned across his chest. The eagle's spread wings glinted with reflected sunlight. You have much work to do. The blow came from nowhere. In its wake, the air rang with the echo of metal on metal, the clashing chime of a great cathedral bell. It was almost beautiful. A Primarch lay in the dust, surrounded by his warriors. None present had ever witnessed such a thing. Ogletal's bolter was raised, aimed at the ranks of Ultramarines who mirrored the gesture in kind. 100 gun barrels, leveled at 100,000. The 7th captain needed 3 attempts to form words. Hold your fire, he whispered into the General Vox channel. Do not fight unless fired upon. Lorgar rested the immense Crozius mace on his golden shoulder. His grey eyes flickered with uncertain emotion as he bared his teeth at the fallen Lord of Macragge. You will never mock me again, brother. That understood. Guilliman's rise was slow, almost hesitant. The golden eagle on his breastplate was split, a valley crack running through its body. You go too far, a softer voice said. Malcador, First Lord of Terror, still clutched his staff. It was all that kept him standing. You go too far. Be silent, worm. The next time you bleed my patience dry, I will do more than slap you aside. Guilliman was on his feet now. He turned an expressionless face back to his brother. Is your tantrum concluded, Lorgar? I must return to the crusade. Come, my son. Corferon's corpse sneer was directed at Guilliman, even as his words were meant for his Primarch. Come, we have much to discuss. Lorgar exhaled and nodded once. The anger was fading, and no longer offered a shield against shame. Yes. Back to the ships. All companies. Corferon spat across the Vox. Return to orbit. Yes, First Captain. Ogletal replied with the others. By your word.